Thank you. Good afternoon, everybody. So what I'm going to talk about today is the assessment process of anti-money laundering and terrorist financing policies around the world. So the FATF is a financial standard setting body. FATF means Financial Action Task Force. So the FATF sets all the standards around the world for anti-money laundering policies and terrorism financing. It was created in '89 by the G20, and it started with all these small these countries. And what they decided it was to set up take on board all the United Conventions and treaties and set up the standards. So it goes from how to criminalize money laundering to the specific obligations to financial institutions and private sector institutions. If you look at the bottom, there are 9 regional-style FATF bodies. So it means that around the world, besides Financial Action Task Force, there are 9 regional groups like FATF. One of them is Gafilat, where I work. So we do exactly as FATF. We contribute within the standard setting body, and we also assess the standards within countries. So there is, around all the regions, we comprise 200 jurisdictions around the world. Countries have committed themselves to fight money laundering and terrorist financing. And they decided to comply with the standards, and they decided to assess themselves with those standards and practices. So the process started around 2000 with the first round. Currently, we are in the 4th round of mutual evaluation process. And up to 2013, we only talked about technical compliance. So when we talked about these standards, we talk about all what is known in my world as the 40 FATF recommendations. The 40 FATF recommendations comprises all the sets of tools and regulations that country must have in place in order to have the minimum preparation to combat money laundering and terrorist financing. It accompanies with interpretative notes of these standards and a glossary with a bunch of terms who tells the country what is money laundering, what is a predicate offense of money laundering, what means confiscation, what means funds and other assets, etc., etc. So the 40 recommendations talk about 8 chapters. The first one is policy, risk, and coordination among the nations. So a country must understand the risks towards money laundering and terrorist financing, and they have to have coordinated policies to address those risks that they face in terms of money laundering and terrorist financing. Then they have to have all the laws and regulations to criminalize money laundering, terrorist financing, how to apply targeted financial sanctions, set of rules to be able to confiscate all proceeds of crimes. And then 60% of the standards are related to regulations and laws that they have to impose obligations to financial and non-financial institutions. That means that most of these standards addresses financial and non-financial sector. What does that mean? It means, for instance, that a bank should be able to identify all the customers and have information and verify all the information of the customers. It means what a bank encounters a person who is in the high political world. That person must be identified because he poses a risk, for instance, of corruption. So it must be identified by the bank or by an accountant who performs certain activities, by a casino, etc. And they have to have a monitoring system to know all customers that perform transactions with a specific financial and non-financial institutions. So that bank, accountant, lawyer, notary, security, stock market institution is able to detect and report suspicious transactions to an institution called Financial Intelligence Unit to gather all the information to produce an intelligence report that then will be submitted to law enforcement authorities to initiate legal action against that person that potentially be a criminal who has committed money laundering or other predicate offenses associated. When we talk about predicate offenses, we talk about drug trafficking, armed trafficking, homicide, environmental crimes, sexual violence crimes, tax crimes, environmental crimes, etc. There are 21 categories, minimum categories of predicate offenses of money laundering. So with all these standards, it establishes this set of rules and regulations, legal framework that a country must have at the minimum base to be able to tackle money laundering and terrorist financing. And in order to know how well a country is doing with that regard, combating terrorist financing and money laundering, there is an assessment methodology. We have the methodology since 2003, the third round mutual methodology, to assess only technical compliance, whether rules and regulations are in place in the country. In 2012, with the changes of the standard, we developed the methodology for assessing not only technical compliance, but assess effectiveness. So why do we do mutual evaluations? So with that methodology, we assess the compliance with the FATF standards, laws, regulations, and effectiveness. The idea is that with every mutual evaluation, a country receives a set of tools, guidance, actions, an action plan to develop in order to improve the anti-money laundering and counter-terrorist finance regime. And it also established a peer pressure between the countries. Countries assess themselves, discuss the report themselves, and they put notes, grades, ratings themselves in order to identify where the high-risk countries are, what are the countries with the most strategic deficiencies, ultimately that can pose a difficulty for the economic to grow, the financial system to be transparent, to be secure. So that's what we do, all the mutual evaluations. And we have different roles. I work for the Secretariat of the Financial Action Task Force Latin America. I coordinate all the mutual evaluation processes of the Latin American countries. So I'm the person with my team that knows the standard at best, know all the precedent decisions of every country that has been assessed over the past 10 years. I know what's happening at FATF level with the FATF countries. And we coordinate all the process. We get the assessors, and that's why there is our interlink at the middle. So the assessors are public representatives of the country themselves. So for instance, if we're going to assess, one of the aspects that we assess is supervision of the financial institutions. We get a supervisor from the central bank from Argentina to assess the regime of Peru. If we are going to assess the legal system and how a country investigates, processes, and sanctions money laundering, we're going to get a prosecutor from Colombia. And if we're going to assess how well is working the financial intelligence unit, and how they produce financial intelligence, we're going to get an analyst from the FIU of Uruguay. So we put together teams within the region, within the membership, to assess a specific country. We have a calendar specifically organized for starting in 2014, and we are going to finish our round in 2021. And also we have reviewers in order to ensure quality and consistency across the global network. The global network means all the 9 regional groups like FATF assess all the countries with the same methodology, on the same rules, so the reports must be comparable. The reports should look alike, assessing a specific jurisdiction based on that methodology and having the same consistency approach on the evaluation. So there are a set of reviewers. One of them is the FATF Secretariat that coordinates all the process in FATF specifically, and reviewers from the countries who are experts in the methodology and in the standards to be able to look at the report and say whether or not this country is being assessed consistently with the methodology and with the accuracy needed for that evaluation. So when we start the process, we start looking at the risk and context of the country. Risk and context means looking at the particularities and specificities of a country. It's different, the risk of money laundering that faces a country like Colombia, where the main threat is the drug trafficking. It's different to assess a country like Switzerland, where the main threat occurs outside Switzerland, where all the predicate offenses occur outside Switzerland, and probably the crimes are being, the proceeds of crime are being laundered within the country. It's different to assess the country, even when we talk about money laundering within Latin American region. It's different to talk about Argentina, which is a country of transit of drugs, than Mexico, that is a country of transit, produce, and commerce within inside or outside the country. So we looked at that risk. What are the threats of money laundering and what are the vulnerabilities of money laundering in a particular jurisdictions? We also look at the context. It's different to have a country like Cuba with no exposure to the economic outside Cuba than a country like Panama, who is an offshore center, an international financial center. So that context applies, and it has an impact on how effective can a country be. Then we assess, like I said, the technical compliance, whether a country has the minimal laws and regulations to tackle money laundering and terrorist financing. If a country doesn't have criminalized money laundering, which is in the standard over the 30 years, probably is in bad shape. And then we looked at the effectiveness assessment that I'm going to relate just in 1 minute. And then at the end, we have conclusions and recommended actions to all the countries that are being assessed. This is how effectiveness looks like or should look like. So we have in the middle suspicious transactions reports. Then if you look up above, there is a whole set of preventive measures. So it means that all financial institutions and non-financial institutions should comply with these preventive measures, from identifying the customers to being able to report suspicious transactions report. Then for a financial institution to actually do something, needs a supervisor for those to be able to supervise whether or not the financial institution is complying. And it needs a sanction regime, so all financial institutions and non-financial should be subject to sanctioning. Then when we looked it down, we looked at the FIU, the Financial Intelligence Unit, who does analysis of the suspicious transactions and all other sorts of information. And then that is submitted to the prosecution authorities an investigation to be able to, sanctioning, and then confiscate the proceeds of crimes. That's the ultimate goal. And that it looks the same for terrorist financing. And all of that is within the context of international cooperation, where countries should be able to cooperate spontaneously and upon request, all sorts of information from all relevant and competent authorities, and with the risk and context that a country faces. So, as I said, the ultimate product of a mutual evaluation at the end of between 14 and 18-month process is a report. The reports are made public because it's a source of information to private sector, financial, governmental, international governmental organizations that provide funds for technical assistance, etc. This is a source of information on risk and threats and vulnerabilities of each of the 200 countries that are being assessed. In terms of technical compliance, these are so far the results. And you looked at that in some cases it goes up to 70%. The country with the lowest terms of technical compliance is Nicaragua. And if you compare that to the third round of mutual evaluation, there is some improvements. So we looked at countries like Costa Rica, who in 2012 had technical compliance of 28%, we go back, currently has 77%. Through the period of 10 years, technical compliance has improved in Costa Rica quite a lot, including the new changes to the standard, which like continuously the standards have been evolving and changing and requiring more compliance with certain aspects. And when we looked at effectiveness, to simplify, with all that is green and white, it means good. Everything that is yellow and red is bad. So there is quite a lot of challenges in terms of effectiveness. It's still, we need to grow as countries and to be able to enforce the laws and regulations that we already have, as technical compliance effectiveness shows. But in terms of producing results, how much sanctioning are we doing of the criminals? How much confiscating are we actually having? Are we really tackling the proceeds of crime? Are we tackling the criminal organization? Not so much. So that's what we need to achieve after the 4 round of mutual evaluations. And also, like I said, the changes continuously. Right now, we're discussing changes and introducing the standards for virtual assets and service provider of virtual assets. We're discussing new elements of introducing on financing of proliferation of weapons. And we have a follow-up process. The mutual evaluation doesn't end with the report. It continuously following and monitoring the recommendations made in the mutual evaluation report, and highlights and makes public what countries have strategic deficiencies. So if you go to the FATF website, you will see which countries have strategic deficiencies and what is the targeted follow-up that the FATF does with these public listing countries. So thank you so much.